Yeah, hello everybody, welcome, and thank you for joining us to discuss togetherness and economics. How can we foster connection and community within the current economic system? My name is Natasha. It's lovely to meet you all and see those of you that I already know. And I'm one of the founder directors of Civil Society Consulting, which is the organisation behind this event. So a little bit about us. We are a not-for-profit. We want health, equality and cohesion. And we believe that civil society organisations are the key. So we support them and catalyse them by being a reliable source of excellent support that's affordable or actually free to grassroots organisations. So we really believe in the power of grassroots organisations that are led by and for communities. So that's a real focus of our work. And you're all here today because we've recently launched a major initiative called 32 Steps to Togetherness, which is all about building connections within and between communities in order to reduce isolation and loneliness and also create the conditions for social change. So this has some pretty interesting intellectual underpinnings. So if you're here, you probably have a sense of how our current economic system, which I'm often calling kind of capitalism on steroids. You're probably familiar with how the current economic system generates widespread isolation. And it's really clear how isolation causes loneliness and loneliness causes mental health issues. It kind of immediately causes depression and anxiety, but also the psychological effects also include feeling distrusting, angry, abandoned, paranoid. So we're really passionate about tackling loneliness as a way of trying to reduce mental health issues across the country. But we're also really interested in the effect that this has not just on the individual, but on society as a whole. So the symptoms of loneliness, as you can imagine from what I've just described, make people susceptible to divisive narratives, which means that widespread loneliness creates the conditions for widespread division and intolerance and polarization. And so the impact of that division is huge because being divided affects how power is distributed in our society. So it allows inequalities to widen and deepen. And without cohesion and trust, democracy can't really work. So over the years, through our work as a kind of not-for-profit consultancy, we've supported a really wide range of civil society organisations. So organisations supporting mothers and parents, older people, drug and alcohol charities, initiatives trying to prevent youth violence. And it can seem like these organisations are sort of tackling seemingly unrelated issues. But actually, because of this sort of vicious cycle that I've just described, we've come to the conclusion that building connection and community is at the heart of the solution to all of them. And that sort of came about looking at root causes over many years. So we've developed 32 Steps to Togetherness, which is 32 practical action that we can all take as individuals or as community leaders to build to reduce our with people from different walks of life and people from different communities in order to foster a sense of togetherness more generally. So, and in a nutshell, we're doing so many things and it's hard to be brief, but in a nutshell, we're trying to bring together people that are bringing people together in their respective communities. So that includes a lot of the grassroots organisations that we work with. They're bringing people together in different parts of the country, in Hartlepool and Hackney, and we want to bring them together and support them in their work. But we also want to support and connect with different community leaders, so community leaders in schools or universities, and help them doing what they're doing and connect them with one another. So the dream is a behavioural and cultural revolution through this kind of network of community leaders. So that's the backdrop for today's discussion. Hopefully some of the latecomers didn't miss too much of that. I'm going to pop the 32 Steps to Togetherness in the chat in case some of you haven't seen that yet. And I'm going to hand over to Abby, who is our host for the day. And Abby's an economist who is soon to become a doctor. And kind of a fun story behind all of this is that Abby and I actually met in primary school. We grew up in the same hometown and we hadn't seen each other for about 15 years. And Abby basically sort of took one look at 32 Steps to Togetherness and came up with the concept for today's event, which I'm so excited about. And yes, over to you, Abby.
Thanks, Natasha. And yeah, hi everyone. I'm Abby. So I just wanted to say another huge thank you to everyone for joining, and also to our brilliant speakers who I will introduce shortly. Just as a little icebreaker as well, for those who are comfortable to do so, we just wondered if you could type in the chat maybe what inspired you to join today, or what interests you about the topic. And meanwhile, I just wanted to spend a short amount of time introducing the topic and speaking about how the event came to be. So a little bit about me. I'm doing a PhD in management, specialising in the future of work and in labour relations. And I was at a conference in Germany where researchers all over the world, including myself, were sort of sharing our research findings on the labour process and workers' experiences. And one theme that was sort of emerging was that workers were really feeling increasingly disconnected from the workplace. And this sort of manifested with adapting to uncertainty, feelings of hopelessness, no longer feeling loyalty to one employer. And in a sense, I think this can be seen as a sort of aftermath of neoliberalism that we've seen since Thatcherism in the 1970s, where we see neoliberal policies which took place on an organisational and structural level through austerity, cuts to public services, dismantling of trade unions, but also on an ideological level, we see the sort of process of individualisation. And that's the sort of idea of this American dream and false ideas of meritocracy. And that's that it's very much on the individual to perform and achieve, and in turn, failures are then personalised. So the shift that we notice is that workers were maybe becoming less now enticed by this neoliberal myth and sort of becoming aware, especially in the context of costs of cuts to public services, cost of living, soaring house prices, interest rates rising, that people were kind of becoming more aware that they were maybe not so getting such a great deal in the workplace, but then sort of at a loss of what to do about this. So we sort of have the job hopping generation among many other issues. But on the whole, there is this idea that there's this big imposing market and all of the issues that presents, and that in itself can be really lonely and isolating to think about. So what I really loved about the 32 steps is that they firstly recognise this problem of disconnection, but also operationalise something that can be quite intangible, which is this idea of community and togetherness. So what I wanted to do is help to bring an economic and employment relations perspective to the 32 steps to togetherness, which really evokes, I think, a more critical lens, but also elicits how and why the idea of community and togetherness can actually be quite political. And that's because there's lots of challenges that our current economic system poses to togetherness and 32 steps. So first and foremost, for most of us, work is where we will spend the majority of our lives, and where we're socialised really to our economic system and to capitalist interests. So if we don't have community and togetherness in our workplace, it can be really hard to achieve overall. Also on an individual level, all of the steps require at least some time, energy, or at least thoughtfulness on behalf of the individual, but we're increasingly in insecure positions, stretched for time and money. And so we see, perhaps unsurprisingly, declines in volunteering, and volunteering is at an all-time low, with just between the years of 2021 and 2022, just 27% of people would be volunteering at least once a year. Add into that our welfare state, which I think really can be understood as a sort of legal and political embeddedness of togetherness and community, has deteriorated as capitalism has developed. So we've seen widespread austerity, cuts to public services, which really are the underpinnings or pillars of our community. So if we don't have sufficient accessible healthcare, if we don't have affordable childcare, what pressure does that put on the community, but also for those individuals who are directly affected as workers? And so it affects our workforce. Organisationally, the steps talk about organising, joining a professional body and unionising, and also opening up your workplace and connecting workers. But again, we've seen attacks on trade unions, with the vast majority of workers ununionised, and also trade union membership consistently declining. We're also seeing less and less contact between workers. If workers are spending less time with one employer, but also with the rise of the gig economy and widespread independent workers, they don't necessarily have one place of work or standard employment rights. So this can make it really difficult to organise through traditional routes. Moreover, it's unfortunately not always seen as economically profitable for companies to encourage unionisation. Like, workers' rights can often clash with capitalist interests, especially when corporations are dealing with increasingly competitive and uncertain markets. So in that context, workers organising can actually be a real headache for employers. So these are just the sort of a few of the many challenges that I think of how the economic system can be at odds with this sort of idea of togetherness and community. But we don't want to just focus on the challenges, and we do believe that there is hope. We've seen, across the UK, solidarity between workers in the form of strike action across many different sectors, with even precarious workers finding novel ways to organise online. And I think the 32 steps can empower workers further. They can offer workers a roadmap for feeling more connected, which they can then take to their workplace. But also the 32 steps empower individuals through statements such as vote with your wallet. And what that's encouraging us all to do really is to think about the community and our own economic choices and actions. We've also seen from corporations and employers narratives around well-being, social responsibility and sustainability emerging. And we're also moving towards flexible working, to name just a few examples. So I think 32 steps could actually almost be profitable for employers and could be helpful in terms of talent retention, productivity, skill training, and the issues that employers are facing. For example, one huge issue on the job market is employers are saying, there's a skill mismatch. They maybe don't have the skills they're looking for, but a huge benefit of community spaces, classes, as well as volunteering can be a great way of sort of sharing our skills with each other, but also gaining new skills. And finally, there may also be alternative ways to organise work entirely. I recently went to Morocco, where I visited the Berber community, and they have families that have been working on organising for hundreds of years, sharing the profits together through cooperatives. So this is a kind of second discussion point and question posed to speakers really, which is how can we work with our current economic system, and how may it actually be beneficial for employers as well to foster greater community and togetherness. So it's a huge topic, and I've spoken in quite broad strokes, but I'm now going to pass over to our brilliant speakers who are going to offer some focus by discussing their work and perspectives. Up first, we have Balaka Bolden, who is going to share her lived experiences of working as a voluntary unpaid carer, while also working in the public services and being a Unison rep. Second, we have Lola Britton from the Oxford Fair Work project, which is a multi-stakeholder project seeking to establish a minimum standard of working conditions for platform workers. And last but not least, we will have political commentator and acclaimed author of Vulture Capitalism, Grace Blakely. So Balaka, I now pass over to you.
Yes, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thanks for turning up, I guess. I'm going to be speaking in my personal capacity as a library worker about the role of libraries, and later on I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about my volunteer role for unpaid carers, an all invisible group, all too ignored in the workplace and by successive governments. When I was asked to present my observations of how far libraries tie in with the ethos of the 32 steps to togetherness, I first had to educate myself about a framework that builds communities that prioritize democracy, human rights, and social welfare. And I found that these steps were manageable steps, emphasizing and establishing independent institutions, promoting accountability and transparency in government, and ensuring freedom of speech and fostering a robust civil society. Now, their chief focus is on reducing inequality and supporting sustainable development while having education and public health systems which should be accessible to all. Ultimately, these steps aim to create societies where citizens are informed, engaged, and free to pursue lives of dignity and opportunity. And as far as I could see, public libraries align very closely with the ethos of the 32 steps to civil society. Under the Libraries and Museums Act of 1964, libraries were set up to serve as accessible centres for information, learning, community engagement, which are core pillars of open society. Libraries provide free access to knowledge and resources, empowering local communities. C.L.R. James, the Trinidadian historian, socialist writer and activist, had a deep appreciation for libraries as institutions. And the reason why I'm bringing up C.L.R. James is because I work in the library where he is honoured, giving his name to the library I work for. He had a deep appreciation for libraries as institutions that democratize knowledge and power, empowering individuals, particularly the working class. In his book, Beyond a Boundary, he reflects on how libraries shaped his own intellectual development. James saw libraries as spaces that enabled self-education, providing access to ideas and literature, regardless of one's social or economic background. He believed libraries played a vital role in fostering critical thinking and autonomy among individuals, which he viewed as essential for an engaged and enlightened citizenry. James' belief in libraries was part of his broader advocacy for accessible education and his critique of elitist structures that limited working class access to knowledge. For him, libraries were transformative spaces that allowed people to connect with history, literature, and politics, empowering them to question and challenge societal norms. In essence, C.L.R. James saw libraries as tools for liberation, offering individuals pathways to knowledge, self-realization, and collective action for change. Modern public libraries also embody the spirit of civil society by promoting inclusivity, education, and informed citizenship. They provide free access to digital skills training and academic support, enabling local residents and their families to learn, explore diverse viewpoints, and stay informed. A key aspect of transparency and accountability in a healthy society. On a Saturday morning, you will find me singing, putting on different voices when I'm reading picture books during the under 5 story time and rhyme time. These are all key in language development, where children can listen to patterns in words and rhythms. It's all a vital leg up to preschool learning. We also provide Lego and coding clubs to expand ideas and young minds, chess clubs to improve strategizing, and the importance of friendly warfare and of losing gracefully. Reading clubs and creative writing led by local community authors for children using our libraries, many of whom will be the next generation of activists, thinkers, and writers. As a result of shifting community values during the effects of the due to the effects of the pandemic, rising costs of living, local residents' frustration and anger at the health and housing inequalities are all too palpable. The council where I work has had to adapt its collaboration and partnership processes to hosting civic discussions, offering lifelong learning programs, and sharing community resources, all of which support democratic and social values. Libraries have now started hosting refugee hubs, empowering individuals to access English language classes and support to participate meaningfully in civic life. They also support equality by offering resources to underserved community and voluntary sector groups, bridging economic divides and fostering social mobility by encouraging dialogue and community problem solving. In essence, libraries build social cohesion and resilience by being safe, open spaces where individuals of all backgrounds can gather, learn, and engage in an inclusive way. Through these programs, public libraries not only align with the ethos of civil society by fostering an informed and empowered public, but also fulfill aspects of the Libraries and Museums Act by promoting and preserving community heritage and cultural access for all. However, this transformational change has come about at an enormously rapid pace since 2023, which is ironic given that our library services had a major restructure in 2023 and saw the loss of nearly a quarter of its workforce, 26% of staff taking voluntary redundancy. This has placed pressure on the current much reduced frontline library staff to continue with their everyday administrative tasks, as well as planning for a range of events and activities for all age groups. Change must be set at an achievable pace and staffed accordingly. Community and voluntary organisations were treated as partners, especially after the joint up work during the pandemic. But now the council can be seen as retrenching to a traditional commissioning provider relationship and taking central control. Is it ever possible to have a genuine partnership when one party holds the purse strings? The council will need to identify the underlying reasons as to why they are undertaking a particular piece of work and to carry out appropriate risk assessments, paying particular attention both to the needs of local residents and to think about who in the borough, other than the council, is best placed to undertake that piece of work. Does it have to be carried out on council premises? In the context of libraries, is it possible to be all things to the local residents? Pop-up health hubs in the library foyer one week, careers advice the next, refugee community hubs. The council must ask itself, isn't this work being done already by local health and community groups who have a genuinely solid track record of delivering those services to the most marginalised sections of our community, as well as having staff who share those languages and culture? And what does the future look like? Well, the future is a budget deficit of £52 million that the council will need to find in savings in the next 3 years. And this is on top of the 21 million council overspend due to rising costs in both social care and homelessness. Anyway, how this will pan out in the future, I don't know. Whether the achievable aims as set out in our library strategy documents will pan out or not, I don't know. It remains to be seen. I also wanted to talk briefly about the role of unpaid carers, those who care for relatives or friends who have a range of physical and neurodivergent conditions such as autism, dementia, as well as profound mental health needs such as psychosis and schizophrenia. It's estimated that there are 5 million carers in the UK, and we have one thing in common: we're all unpaid, yet we save social care billions of pounds because of our caring responsibilities for those who are unwell and vulnerable. Through supporting a member of my family who suffers from multiple neurodivergent conditions, as an unpaid carer, I've managed to bring my lived experience to my voluntary work that aims to improve the lives of unpaid carers. I have been a member of my local carer centre since 2020, and I've been an active volunteer during that time, raising the profile of unpaid carers. A carer centre provides comprehensive support, from access to information to emotional support and practical advice in a safe and confidential space. Part of my volunteer role involves meeting with carers, visiting their loved ones in an acute mental health ward, where I can share insights based on my own personal experience of caring, as well as raising awareness of support forums for unpaid carers by way of peer networks, skill development programs, such as being assertive, living on a budget, and pointers in navigating the healthcare system, heightening awareness of specialised services on offer for carers, such as carers assessment, one-to-one emotional support services, and advocacy services, where trained advocates assist carers in representing their needs with local authorities and healthcare providers, as well as signposting to other services, both locally and nationally. The importance of the triangle of care has to be mentioned, is putting the vulnerable person requiring attention at the top of the triangle, supported on one side by the unpaid carer and on the other side the professional medical services. All too often there's a mismatch of expectation between carers and medical experts that can have...
Sorry to interrupt, but could I ask you to... Thank you. Sorry, it's so interesting.
Wrap up. Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
All too often there is a mismatch of expectations that can sometimes end up further exacerbating their clinical symptoms and also the mental well-being of carers. Okay, I'm going to end there. Sorry if I've...
Thank you so much, Balika. No, not at all. That was so interesting, and thank you for sharing your lived experiences with us as well.
You're
really
welcome.
In the interest of time, let's go straight to Lola from the Fair Work, Oxford Fair Work Project. Thank you, Balika.
Okay, hi everyone. Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Abby, and thanks, Balika. That was so interesting. I'm going to try and follow, and I'm going to share my screen because I've provided some slides. So just give me a second to make sure that works.
And throughout all these little bits of waiting, please do be thinking about your questions for the Q&A that we're going to come to afterwards.
Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so yeah, as Abby said, I'm Lola and I work for the Fair Work Project as a research assistant. And today I'm going to basically use our research on digitally mediated work at kind of the economic margins to talk about some of the challenges I think we face. So I'll start by providing a brief overview of the project, and then I'll dig into 3 challenges, drawing on kind of all of our research. So Fair Work is an action research project, and essentially what we do is we try to assess the impact of technological change on working conditions around the world. Most of our research demonstrates that the effect is negative, but we don't accept that as inevitable. Rather, we try to generate pro-worker change by basically scoring companies out of 10 based on their adherence to a set of fair work principles. I haven't included the principles in detail here because I didn't think it was really necessary, but you can have a look at them on the website. And if you do take a look at them and you work in what we might call a conventional job, you might think, oh, they're pretty basic. And that's the point, they are basic. They're not meant to be some kind of utopic workplace standards. They're just kind of like basic minimum standards of fairness. But the reality is that millions of marginalized workers across the world do not enjoy these basic minimum standards. And I think that's demonstrated through the history of our research. So we've conducted about 700 evaluations, and we've given one 10 out of 10. And this is kind of an example of our leaderboard. So when we do research, we try to publish the scores in this kind of like league table. So this is from our UK research in 2023. I'm sure some of you will recognize some of the companies on here. So this kind of gives you an indication of, you know, what some of the usual scores look like. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the scoring process at the end, but we don't just kind of say this is a score and that's kind of it. We try to generate change throughout that scoring process. So we are directly engaging with companies. Now, Fair Work began about 5 years ago, and it began with a focus on the digitally mediated gig economy. And as you can see from the quote I've got on the slide here, that basically refers to labour markets that are characterised by independent contracting that happens through, via and on digital platforms. So we've recently expanded to also consider like outsourced data work in the supply chains of artificial intelligence, but I'm going to focus primarily on the gig economy today because I think it's a really apt lens through which to consider some of the challenges that we face with regards to togetherness and community, because although the challenges extend beyond it and they're not unique to it, I think as a phenomenon, the gig economy really encapsulates some of the changes that have kind of led to some of these challenges. So at each point, I will be focusing on the gig economy, but I'll try to draw some broader connections where they are relevant. So onto the challenges. I think when I was preparing for this, the questions that Abby posed, I think are really interesting because technically speaking, the labour market has never been more connected. Broad kind of changes such as like globalization, outsourcing, the mass rollout of the internet, they've all created what some might call a planetary labour market in which lots of work is no longer necessarily physically rooted. So workers might be providing services for firms that are headquartered, 3,000 miles away instantaneously. And although, digital change, along with these other kind of processes that I just mentioned, has created some new opportunities that for people that may otherwise struggle to access work, those opportunities are characterized by things that pose significant challenges for togetherness and community. So particularly high levels of atomization and social isolation, extreme precarity, and an absence of workplace democracy. So I'll talk about those a little bit more now. So I have some summaries on my slide here. And starting with atomization, this basically refers to a situation in which workers are divided and dispersed. So in the gig economy, workers are, physically, spatially isolated. You might be working from your laptop, alone, which I know lots of people do now, obviously with the rise of, remote working more generally. Or you might be working in your car if you're an Uber driver, or on your bike if you're a food delivery driver, or in someone's house if you are a domestic worker using these apps. And as I think, Abby, you mentioned this in the introduction, for lots of people, there is no shared workspace. You're not in a place with people who you see all the time. You're kind of working very much on your own. And it's not just a spatial element, workers are also contractually individualized. So Abby, I think you mentioned this also, workers in the gig economy are contracted not as employees, but often as independent contractors. So that's essentially where, companies are kind of treating them as if they're like a small business in and of themselves. And on lots of these platforms, there's actually like an intentional oversupply of labor. So that means really there's never going to be enough work for everyone. So all of this combined kind of creates this situation in which workers are encouraged to think of each other not as collaborators, but as competitors. And I think when we're talking about atomization and isolation, it's also really important to talk about the way technology is itself deployed. In the gig economy, workers aren't managed by human beings. They're not working in a team. They are directed and instructed by algorithms and AI systems. Now, this isn't unique to the gig economy. Technology is being rolled out generally across lots of, workplaces. And I think in many of them, it is limiting sociality. But it's not just atomization and socialization that I think poses a problem. It's also kind of the material conditions. So, we have seen the rise of precarious work. And I mean, I'm sure all of you have heard of precarious work. Some of you have no doubt experienced precarious work. But essentially, this is defined in opposition to the standard employment relationship that was secured by organized labor in the 20th century. And it's absolutely not new, precarious work, nor is it unique to the gig economy. I mean, for millions of workers around the world, precarious work really is the norm. But as I stated, it has risen in places like the UK due to the deregulation of labour markets that kind of started to kick in the 1980s. And this, as part of this kind of deregulation, what was really promoted was flexibility and job quantity in favour of as opposed to job security and job quality. And I think the gig economy is obviously a kind of particularly demonstrative manifestation of this, because as I said, workers aren't employed and there is no guarantee of work. You get work when the algorithm offers you a task. And obviously this kind of translates into extreme levels of unpredictability and insecurity. So there is no minimum wage guarantee. That means low wages. That means excessive overwork and a lack of kind of workplace protection. And I think precarity obviously kind of provides a barrier to togetherness and community for quite self-evident reasons. So, in some of our research, we've come across workers doing kind of 60, 70 plus hours a week. Obviously, this leaves very, very little time to actively contribute to your community or to volunteer. And, you know, I'm sure some of us who work kind of 40 hours a week struggle to find the time to do that. So there's that factor. I think also there's kind of like the fear. So, you know, Abby, you mentioned the rise of trade unions, and I'm going to talk about that a little, not the rise of trade unions, the demise of trade unions. And I'm going to talk about, you know, democracy and that in a minute. But I think if you're already in a really unstable position with regards to your work, then there's an added fear around maybe coming together with other workers to try to challenge some of that. And, you know, in our research, we have encountered examples of trade union victimization, which obviously brings me to this third factor, which is the lack of workplace democracy. Now, I think, you know, it's fair to say that true workplace democracy is something that very few of us experience, unless you work for a co-op, for example. And, you know, there's a theorist, Isabella Ferreras, who, and I've got a quote from her here, and she basically talks about that work in a capitalist democracy is a contradictory experience, because the laws of capitalism govern the workplace, and the laws of democracy, at least in theory, govern our wider social experience. And, you know, I think collective bargaining through workplace representation is a really important counterbalance to some of the power asymmetries that exist in the workplace. It doesn't provide workers with the right to manage, but it does allow, you know, them to exercise some influence over some of the conditions that kind of govern their work. But for workers in the gig economy, they don't have access to collective bargaining because they are engaged as independent contractors. And so even though workers can and have joined trade unions to kind of build power and connect and share their grievances, there isn't that kind of institutional space for this. And so obviously it's a lot more difficult. And, you know, I think all of these things together, obviously, as I've tried to say, create different kinds of barriers for togetherness and community. And particularly when we're looking at the open up your workplace bucket in the 32 steps, I think it's easy to kind of see that some of them are just quite simply impossible when we're talking about, you know, more precarious forms of work such as gig work. But, you know, as Abby said, people are trying to do things to kind of challenge some of this. I'm going to primarily focus on what Fair Work is doing, because obviously I'm representing Fair Work, but I do want to give a nod to the fact that, you know, precarious workers over the past couple of years have done a lot to kind of reject the individualization and come together to try to challenge some of this. Now, Fair Work's approach kind of recognizes that in order to improve working conditions for some of the most marginalized workers, which I think is key to creating better conditions for togetherness and community, we need actions from a diverse range of stakeholders. So I've tried to kind of visualize our theory of change here. And there are 4 parts. One is companies. As I said, we rate companies against universal standards and each other, and we publicize those scores. And in doing so, we seek to leverage the reputational sensitivities to incentivize change. And so far, we've secured over 300 changes in line with the principles. But we also seek to use our research to, you know, help to generate evidence-based policy making. And we also work with workers and organized labor, using our research to kind of help them create some content that maybe informs workers of their rights, and also bring them together through kind of stakeholder meetings. And finally, we also seek to inform and educate consumers about the working conditions of the people that might be delivering their food or driving their taxi, or, you know, working behind some of the products and services that they're using online. So that brings me to the final point, and this is kind of a bit of a plug, but I noticed that one of the 32 steps is vote with your wallet, and I guess this is Fair Work's version of that. So we have this thing called the Fair Work Pledge, and this is basically a way for individuals or organizations to pledge their support for fairer work. So the QR code should work. If it doesn't, sorry about that. You can just email me and I'm happy to answer any questions. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lola. That was so interesting. And yeah, I've been a huge fan of the Fair Work project for a long time. So it was great to hear more about that. And I love how you bring different stakeholders together. So thanks so much for that. And I'm going to pass quickly over to acclaimed author of Vulture Capitalism, Grace Blakely, who is going to wrap us up.
Hi, thank you so much for those extremely interesting presentations. It was great to hear from everyone about some ideas that I think relate very closely to some of what I'm going to say today about my book, Vulture Capitalism. So, you know, we're talking about the ways in which kind of loneliness and alienation can be political. And I think these things are actually very, very deeply political. What I write about in my book, Vulture Capitalism, is basically about how the kind of free market movement that we had in the 1980s, this was particularly clear with politicians like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, and others who pushed this view of kind of free market economics as based on an attempt to kind of shrink the state and expand markets, which were perceived as kind of realms of personal freedom. That the economy and the society that we live in doesn't really abide by any of those free market principles, and in fact contains an immense amount of centralized planning. So the actually existing capitalist economies are characterized by what effectively looks more like kind of concentrated oligarchy than it does free markets and democracy. And that's the largest part of the book, I suppose, is dedicated towards that kind of critique of capitalist systems. But the thing that I think is most interesting and relevant to what we're going to be talking about today is how people kind of organize to resist those forms of centralized power, and how the free market move that we saw in the 1980s was less about actually establishing free markets and much more about pushing back against those forms of collective power that kind of became much the 70s and 80s. And I think the way to kind of present some of these ideas is to look at the sense people have today and the sense we see across all our communities and workplaces. We've just been hearing about how these factors manifest themselves in the workplace. This sense of powerlessness, which is common to workers across different industries. It's common to communities. It's common to just citizens who will talk about their feelings of kind of powerlessness and alienation in an economy that seems as though it's kind of geared towards protecting the interests of those at the very top. And responding to this was really kind of why I wanted to write the book. There's one, part of the book which is really an explanation for this. So it's, we're told we live in these free market systems where we all have freedom to kind of choose whatever goods we want, to work wherever we want. And, we live in a kind of democracy as well. So we're free to influence politics. And then the actual reality of living in a capitalist economy, which is an economy characterized by monopoly power, the kind of fusion of political and economic power in service of of maintaining support for vested interests, and of kind of living in a world and in a society in which you're told that you're free, but actually a huge amount of the decisions that affect your everyday life have already been structured by someone else before you even get to make those choices. So that's the kind of explanation of why of this kind of like cognitive dissonance, I suppose, that comes from living in a capitalist society whilst being told that you're free. But there's also, and I think this is kind of in many ways more important, this sense of disempowerment is rooted in a particular set of kind of sociological and psychological transformations that have come with this transition towards neoliberalism. And that's kind of what I want to focus more on today. Because Thatcher, when she was elected, had a lot of great quotes. Obviously, the one you will be most familiar with is "There's no such thing as society." But there was another one, which is that the method is economics, the object is to change the soul. Thatcherism was really not just about this kind of mission to kind of promote free markets and privatization and deregulation, all of which, fails to really describe what the neoliberal economic transformation was really about. It was also about embedding kind of competitive individualism within all of our lives. And if you look at the measures that were implemented to kind of try and embed that, you can see there's a kind of carrot and there's also a stick. So the most obvious factors are the stick that was used to kind of beat those that were involved in collective organizing. So you can see this obviously with the assault on the unions, with the anti-union legislation that was introduced by both Thatcher and successive governments after that was really designed to kind of constrain those forms of collective organizing. But you also see it in the kind of centralization of political power, the crushing of the GLC, the kind of crushing of various different local government administrations that were the sources of opposition to this economic model, and the centralization of political power in Westminster. So these kind of political and economic shifts are all part of this kind of stick that was about undoing the collective power that had become much more prominent during the post-war period. But then there's also this carrot, approach, which was how do we encourage people to view competing with one another as something that is going to benefit them? How do we really kind of embed this in people's lives? And I like to think about that transition in three ways. So there was a transition in the way that people thought about themselves along three separate lines: from worker to investor, entrepreneur, from citizen to consumer of public services, and from community to household. And these were all encouraged by various different policy shifts that sought to, embed these kind of different forms of subjectivities that encouraged us to see ourselves as kind of competitive, isolated, atomized individuals who are just kind of bumping up against one another in free markets. When it comes to the transition from worker to investor entrepreneur, you see this very clearly through things like the changes that we saw in the housing market. So, you know, people in my parents' generation, for example, would have been able to buy a house very, very cheap, 20, 30,000 pounds. And then within a couple of decades, it's worth several £100,000. And this is, there's a whole number of policy changes that are linked to that shift. But the way it's understood is as a kind of the success of entrepreneurialism, basically, for that generation. They see themselves as having succeeded in reading the market very effectively. And this also goes for things like, the privatizations of pensions and much greater levels of investment in stock markets and the purchasing of the shares of privatized companies and utilities. All of these things were framed as kind of individual entrepreneurial successes. So there was this kind of carrot of like, if you operate in markets, if you kind of engage in markets, particularly financial markets, in these ways that we're encouraging you to do, you will become wealthy. And that was realized for many people and embedded this idea of, okay, you're not a worker, your prosperity isn't really linked to your wage, it's linked to the value of your assets versus your liabilities, which is something that encourages us to think of ourselves as basically kind of mini capitalists whose interests are aligned with those of the finance sector and business more generally, rather than as workers whose interests are kind of opposed to particularly those of kind of bosses, because we would be able to kind of increase our prosperity by coming together and organizing and demanding higher wages. Instead, a quicker and easier route to increasing our prosperity is to invest in stock markets. And of course, the inverse of that, for those who were not able to kind of jump on that ladder and achieve those sorts of gains, if the people who won see it as a result of their own personal success, the people who lose see it as a result of their own personal failings. And this particularly comes out when you think about the kind of ideology that surrounds debt. So, the way that these kind of asset purchases were facilitated was through financial deregulation and just the accumulation of masses, immense amounts of debt, which, if you're able to use that to purchase assets, can make you rich. But if you can't use that to purchase assets, it can put you in a position of extreme insecurity, because obviously, you don't know what's going to happen to interest rates. If you're, putting things on your credit card just to make ends meet, which is what people are increasingly doing during the cost of living crisis, that's going to put you in a very precarious financial situation. And because of the morality that we have around debt, that comes to be seen as a personal failing. So if you win, you're an investor, you're an entrepreneur, you have a lot of assets, you're very successful, that's, all down to your own nous and intelligence and ability to read markets. If you are saddled by debt and you have a low income, that's your own fault for failing to read the market effectively. So again, this kind of shift from people who are understanding themselves as workers to people understanding themselves as investors and entrepreneurs is a really significant part of the neoliberal shift. You also have the transformation of politics. So people cease to see themselves as citizens involved in a kind of mass movement that aims to shift political outcomes from the ground up. And instead, we have what political scientists call the cartelization of political parties. So they become kind of unmoored from the mass movements that often created and founded and sustained them. And instead, like kind of business cartels, come to cooperate with each other in pursuit of the kind of maintenance of the status quo. And rather than getting their resources from these mass movements, come to get their resources just from a close relationship with the state. And the relationship between the state and the citizen is re-engineered to become the relationship between a provider of services and a consumer of services. So if you don't like the services that you're getting, then you can kind of, shop around and maybe move to a different place or a different country, and that's your kind of exercise of your vote. It's the kind of democracy of the market in many ways. What you can't do is organize with other people to demand that that model changes because of this shift in the way that political parties work. And then finally, there's this shift from community to household. So for a lot of different reasons, including those changes to housing that I've already mentioned, those factors underpinning kind of political centralization as well, and changes to kind of architecture and economic geography, we start to see a shift from forms of community organizing that were really critical, particularly kind of during the post-war period, and often underpinned a lot of the successful labor organizing that took place during that moment, to a much more kind of isolated, individualized understanding of the household, in which community organizing becomes much harder and much more challenging. Now, all of these things, the kind of carrot and the stick that facilitated the emergence of kind of competitive individualism, or the embedding of competitive individualism, are a really kind of intimate part of the free market agenda. And the reason for that is that agenda was less about kind of shrinking the state and expanding the market, and much, much more about creating opportunities for collaboration for those at the top, and then undermining the ability of people to collaborate in other areas of society. Whether that's in the labor movement, whether that's in their communities, whether it's in political movements or whatever. And that's, I think, why these questions around kind of alienation and collaboration and competition are so political, because the world that we find ourselves in today has not emerged by accident. It's not as though we were kind of randomly seeing this kind of decline in social capital, which is the narrative that some sociologists have. It was very much part of a wider political and economic transition that was designed to encourage us to compete against one another and to think of society as based on this constant competitive process that sorts people into successful and not successful, into worthy and not worthy. This has been an incredibly powerful legitimating tool for neoliberalism, basically, because we internalize our position within that hierarchy that we're told is given to us by this kind of neutral market mechanism, despite the fact that, as we've seen, that market mechanism is not neutral, because you have, markets themselves being dominated by large, powerful corporations, and then, this kind of political economic fusion that involves the kind of constant intervention within markets by politics and politicians, but not in pursuit of making them fairer and more just, in pursuit of kind of propping up vested interests. So you have an unfair system, a game that's rigged, but you internalize your position within that game as a reflection of your kind of underlying value as a worker or as a citizen or whatever. And it makes people much less likely to kind of organize to resist that system. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in today. The absence of, or the kind of retreat of various different forms of organizing, whether that's community organizing within the labor movement, organizing in political movements, that has been the trend over the past kind of 50 years, only briefly arrested during certain moments, is what has given us the kind of epidemic of alienation and loneliness, but also the big disparities of political and economic power that we've seen today. So I guess my contention would be that these issues around isolation, alienation, and loneliness are not neutral, but in fact emerge from a particular kind of system that has encouraged us to basically divide ourselves from each other, and that the powerful actually benefit from this. So I'll end there.
So happy we've got you to cover that side of things, Grace. It's so good, so good.
Yeah, thank you so much, Grace. That was really interesting. And now we have time for a quick Q&A. And to kick us off, really, I have a question, I guess about more of the hopeful side of the conversation, and a little bit about so what do the speakers think that we can do and sort of is being done? I know, like Balaka, you have some experience organising in the library, and also Grace, maybe if we come to you first, Grace, we just finished talking, but where you kind of see hope emerging, I guess.
So I think I see hope in a lot of different places, because, whilst that movement to try and divide people, and to kind of push back against these forms of collective power has been pretty successful, it hasn't been completely successful, So in the last part of Vulture Capitalism, I look at examples of people kind of coming together to kind of reimagine various different forms of democratic planning. So there's kind of community organizers who I wrote an article a while back about a village in North Wales called Blaenau Ffestiniog, in which a group of people within the community had pushed back against this kind of left behind narrative that they'd been given by politicians, because this was a kind of deindustrialized community that was kind of really suffering as a result of all the changes that we'd seen in the global economy over many decades. But instead of kind of giving into that narrative and saying, you know, we want politicians to do something differently, and then being disappointed, people in that community came together and started building community interest companies in everything from, you know, zip lines in the former slate mines through to community energy companies, and brought all of those companies together under a kind of new organization that coordinated them and allowed them to create jobs for local people, until ultimately politicians started coming to them and saying, how did you do this? This is amazing. We want to replicate this model in other places. And, you know, their response was basically, well, you know, yes, this can be replicated in other places, but it comes from the particular needs and strengths and resources that we have in this community. And that's what you have to build on. So it's those sorts of examples, and they exist within, as I've said, communities that are organizing. There are some fantastic examples of new forms of organizing across, you know, various different sectors in the economy. So, you know, gig economy organizing, as I'm sure Lola will be familiar with, another kind of hopeful example of gig economy workers often working for these kind of super powerful platforms, coming together and not just organizing to defend their rights, but actually setting up kind of alternative cooperative digital platforms that are not so exploitative. So it's these kind of, you know, creative forms of that are about, yes, resisting exploitation within the current system, but also creating something new that allows people to move beyond this model of kind of competitive individualism. That gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, brilliant, definitely. And I think, yeah, Lola, that does link to a lot of what you're doing with the Fair Work project, and in terms of really empowering individuals as well. And I thought as well, yeah, Lola, did you want to add anything to that point about sort of hope and Balaka as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like with regards to the final point on cooperatives, I can share kind of some personal experience here, because I did actually basically support a platform cooperative. I was doing some work for a cooperative based in London, and it was a food delivery platform cooperative. Unfortunately, it didn't really work that much, because I mean, not didn't work, but we ended up having to kind of close things down. And that doesn't mean that the idea itself isn't good. It is. It's just that the conditions in certain places for cooperatives are not that supportive. I mean, like, there's a global movement of kind of platform cooperatives, which includes a range of different types of co-ops. And you know, for these things to really have like a chance, because obviously operating within like existing markets is really difficult. And with regards to kind of attracting funding, and just kind of like sustaining things, especially in that like initial phase, because when co-ops get going, they are shown to be kind of more sustainable with regards to like they fail less than typical companies. But like obviously raising capital is really difficult. So I think it just also speaks to the need for like local governments to really actively support things like this. And there are some local governments that are already doing that. So I live in Islington, and in Islington the council had this whole project where they were trying to support co-ops. So the co-op that I was doing some work for was supported through that. And you know, I work in a cooperatively run workspace sometimes, and that's kind of part of this. So I think there's also the Preston model, which some of you might have heard of, and they're doing a lot to kind of support basically community wealth building, including kind of the building out co-ops. So I think that's kind of another point that I didn't mention. And then, yeah, obviously Fair Work is kind of really attempting to like use our research to generate some change here and now. And we have secured some improvements. So I guess there's an area for hope as well. But it's obviously, as I said, these are like basic workplace standards. So you know, you kind of need lots of different approaches, right? Obviously, like Grace said, the more kind of creative forms of organizing. And then there's also like ensuring that for, you know, people that maybe aren't able to kind of do some of this more creative organizing, the basics are there as well, and hopefully that can kind of empower like further things on top of that.
Yeah, that's great, Lola. All about the hope. I just wanted to jump in before we move on to Balaka. I think it's going to be so interesting to hear your perspectives as a trade unionist, as a member of a trade union. But I just wanted to encourage everyone to pop your questions in the chat, and we can have them lined up ready to go when Balaka's finished.
Yeah, Balaka, is there anything that you wanted to ask about? Oh yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Yeah, I think I've unmuted myself now. Yes, it's just to say that I hear what people have said about declining numbers in the trade unions, but certainly from my perspective, and certainly from the last couple of years, with the push by the government to put these very draconian anti-trade union legislation through, which ultimately wasn't done, was defeated actually. I find that more and more people are turning in the workplace to their trade unions for support. They're looking to us in a way to weaponize themselves against some of the bad practices of the big bosses in work, who play off each other, play workers off each other in really petty ways. And I think the more that we've become independent of things that are going on around us, we've had to self-organize ourselves more, have had great success in setting up self-organizing groups. For example, we've got a divestment group who are trying to get the council to divest their interests in Israeli arms and manufacturing of the companies that are creating such devastation for the people in Gaza. And we're having great success with that. We just have to keep ploughing on. Anytime we can get our bosses to stand back and reflect on what they've done. For example, this is might appear very insignificant, but we won the curtailing of our tea breaks, for example. They wanted to take away some of our minutes to the tea break, but we fought that. It might seem small and trivial, but for the bosses, that's a big thing when they find they have lost and they had to go back on what they were doing. And we have to just keep trying our best to unbalance them in this way.
No, thank you, Balak. I think that's brilliant to have a kind of real example of where workers can come together and make small, but they are significant to the workforce, those changes that you can make. And we've had a couple of good questions in the chat, which kind of alert to how to kind of align togetherness and community with capitalist interests, and how can we kind of solve the fact that maybe it's not always in the interest of corporations. So how can we work with corporations, and how is that possible to make this initiative kind of more attractive to employers? So I don't know if any of the speakers wanted to jump in on that. Lola, I know you have some experience of, yeah, sorry.
Should we come to David, who's asked that question? David, yes. Tisha, do you want to?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so it's an area that I'm really interested in. I think partly because of my background working within HR, within organisations. So I've got experience of trying to introduce and embed things like this that are very sort of people and human focused, but not always sort of obviously in sync with creating profits and delivering sort of commercial gains. So I know it can sometimes be a bit of a challenge to get companies to sort of buy into this. So I think in some cases, if things like inclusion and well-being aren't embedded in what they do, then it can be quite difficult for them to see the benefits. And invest any sort of time and effort in making this kind of stuff happen. So I think it was just to get thoughts really on how we could tackle those situations where we want to make inroads and help sort of push this up the agenda and make it real within organisations. But there may be some resistance or a lack of interest in this.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you've asked that, David, because that was our kind of slightly controversial framing of today's event. It's like, these two things are at odds, but is there a way of working with the system? So yeah, thank you.
Do you want me to jump in and try to answer that? Is that, yeah? Cool. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I do have some direct experience because, yeah, what Fair Work tries to do is to directly engage companies. So when we're scoring them, the point is not just to kind of look at, so the way we kind of collect evidence is we go to management for some evidence. We also try to speak to workers and, organize labor, and also do desk research, and we put it all together. So obviously in that process, we are directly talking to management. And I think it's interesting. There are a couple of things to say about that. I think one thing is it's interesting because some of this research has been conducted like 6 years in a row in different countries. So in India, we've done it. We have a partner team and they've done it like 6 times. And at first, a lot of the companies ignored us. They just simply didn't respond. And then the next year, a few more. And then the next year, a few more. And then the next year, a few more. So I think on the one hand, it's simply like you kind of keep pushing this agenda and you're building up because then the media start taking more notice. And then actually that puts pressure on the companies to respond because it's not in their interest to ignore us, because in that respect, they're hindering their ability to get points, right? So it's almost like, I think one thing is just simply to keep pushing the agenda. And the other thing is like recognizing the resources at your disposal to maybe try to, and using that to push your interest. So like I said, we publicly disseminate our scores. So in that respect, we think that like sharing our research and making it, because I guess in comparison to some kind of like academic research, we tried to make it like, the leaderboard is really easy to understand. It's like 0 out of 10 is really bad. 10 out of 10 is the best you can get, but it's still the basic minimum standards. So I think it's almost like how you communicate this stuff as well. And then we're using that as leverage to kind of say, well, we're going to publish this anyway. And so, if you want to engage, then you probably should, because if you don't, it's still going to be there. So I think that's really helped us in kind of trying to get some movement on some of this stuff. I hope that's kind of answered your question. Obviously, I'm speaking to the particular example of trying to engage big platforms. So I can't really speak to the experience of trying to do it internally, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it was really interesting what you said, and I really like the the leaderboard thing that you had, because I think one thing I've found is that the points thing where you sort of listed the companies. I think rightly or wrongly, a lot of organisations are are very competitive versus each other. So I used to work in financial services, which probably won't go down very well with this crowd, but it's very sort of competitive between the large financial institutions. So it's almost like that social proof concept. So if I was at HSBC, so if we saw that Barclays or Citi or whoever were doing something quite specific that was getting them ahead, then that almost like put pressure on us to think, actually, we need to be quite creative and try something similar. So I think that kind of almost like social pressure, if you like, between organisations can help, but obviously it needs to be sustainable and you need to do it for the right reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
And did any of the speakers have anything else to add on that question of kind of aligning with corporations and what their interests may also be?
Do you want me to come in on that?
Yeah, or we can go for another question if you think.
Yeah, I think go for another question, because I think you've already answered that pretty extensively.
So so Chris Evans is asking, Chris, would you like to pose your question, sort of asking about digital growth, which I think is a really good point.
Yeah, there's 2 things for this, just in terms of the way we as consumers receive services. So this year, for example, I've had a couple of flights cancelled by BA. Unilaterally, I've got no idea why, and I've never been told why. And trying to get money back as a result of that is just absolutely impossible, because you're talking to digital platforms and unfortunately they're not talking back. So that's, as a consumer, I just feel quite powerless. But equally at local government level, there's lots of cuts, lots of reduction of services. And so in Bromley, where I work, there's a lot of focus on digital transformation of social services and adult and social care, and more stuff is migrating online, and a lot of less and less interface will take place through people, and that sort of a trend just seems to be absolutely relentless, and it's quite difficult to stop that. I just wonder whether there's is there any thought in terms of progressive ways that not just challenging that as a trend, but thinking about the ways we can use digital as a platform to engage more and more people, because we're not using it progressively at all. And the final thing is just thank all the speakers. I think it was very impressive. The interesting thing about this whole conversation at the moment is it does feel very niche, whereas when the GLA were around, for example, this would be a common currency, and there would be issues around, well, actually, what does an alternative economic strategy and an alternative development model look like? So absolutely, in terms of institutional power and in terms of shareholder power, I mean, I think that's, and the way that's structured, I think that's moved on a pace, really.
Yeah, brilliant. Also, sorry, I am conscious we're going over, but please do stay if you'd like to continue the discussion, and that'd be great. And yeah, I think
I'm going to have to head off in a bit, so shall I very briefly come back to that?
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Thank you, Grace.
I think there are some really interesting examples of organizations that have kind of operated in those sorts of spaces, so in and around local government, and made use of the opportunities that that kind of digital platforms have provided. And I'm thinking in particular in terms of there's a number of examples of care co-ops that have been set up across the UK, the US, and a number of other countries, where care workers have basically come together and said, we're sick of being exploited by private equity corporations. Basically, there are a number of different care homes, particularly in the UK, that are run by private equity, are extremely extractive, oriented towards kind of slashing costs and making life much harder for their workers, and instead set up these co-ops, some of which are just worker co-ops. So, all the care workers come together, they set up the corporation, they tender for services, sell into local government, and maybe coordinate that process on digital platforms. But there are also some really interesting examples of workers that have done that and then also sought to engage patients in the provision of care. So there's one in the UK, actually, where care workers came together and set up this new care co-op, and then also used like online and in-person tools to allow those in receipt of care to have to feed into how this organization was being run and how that care was being provided. And that kind of democratization of service provision through the use of the cooperative structure is, I think, a really exciting thing that we're seeing a lot more of, particularly in in the care space, but also in the provision of kind of what were previously often outsourced public services more generally.
Yeah, I think that's a really brilliant point. And I think it's nice to feel hopeful about technology, because I think there are ways we can use it in a hopeful way, despite all the sort of doom and gloom, especially with sort of AI coming in the picture. And Chris, Monologue, sorry, I'm not sure about how to pronounce your surname, but you had a really good point in the chat, and I don't know if you're still here and like to make it yourself, but you spoke about how it can be profitable and really beneficial. Did you sort of want to pose a point or question there? But I think that's
Chris Minogue, like Kylie Minogue.
Yes, it's Minogue. It's Minogue like Kylie. I don't look as good in the cold hot pants. Sorry, because I've come down with man flu, so apologise. I'll have to get through this with a few sniffles, I think. But certainly, I work for a very large responsible business network called Business in the Community, and I really do see the positivity in action day to day. Just to give you some off the cuff examples, we see very large organizations engaging in simple tasks such as community litter picks. Great way for building a team, great way for an organization to give back to their community. And actually, we hear that it opens new doors for opportunities all of the time. In addition to that, we've run a number of campaigns with regard to opening doors and inclusive recruitment there, so things like Ban the Box, which some of you may know, which supports ex-offenders into work, alongside other charters such as our Race at Work charter, all aimed at diversifying the workforce. When you do that, the benefits are endless, and you see time and time again that there are benefits. So there is some positivity out there. I do see a push for organisations to make these positive changes. Sometimes I do think it's a bit of a badge wearing purpose, and I do question whether organisations are really committed to the change. But then every now and then you come across a really in tune CEO and actually see the difference. And I'm sure there's countless organisations that I could name, but I shan't in the interest of fairness. But I do wonder sort of like, the system's clearly broken. We all know that. And actually, what's the place if the system's broken? We're kind of stuck with this system, and intrinsically we can't change something that's been put in place over a number of decades. What's the role of these organizations, and how can we sort of ensure that we as consumers and as individuals move forward with it? I think for me, 32 steps is one of the most simple ways, because you can do that as an individual. It's very simple to engage that way with your community. And if everybody just took a handful of those steps there, we'd really see a positive difference. But I just wanted to put that to the panel, sort of like, what's the role of, I suppose, social economics in all of this, and how do we leverage that?
I'm so glad you asked that, Chris. And I was actually just thinking I might want to throw the question back to you a little bit, because you've got such an amazing vantage point of where businesses are at, because you work with so many different businesses. Like, do you think that the resource of 32 steps to togetherness will help them? Or, how do you think they'd respond to maybe not all of the slightly more political side of the things we're saying today, but the idea of building connections within and between communities through the workplace, through the steps?
I think generally on a local level, it'd be received very well. And I certainly see that. So I deliver a place-based program in Rochdale in Greater Manchester, which has got some very marginalised communities within it. But I think for me, point and purpose there, I think organisations want to do good and want to be seen to do good. And whilst the bottom line for boards quite often is the capital side of it and the profit and loss there, actually as employees, I don't think anybody wants to go out there and do any bad into the world, certainly the minority. So I think pushing out the 32 steps, yeah, definitely I can see an appetite for it. Maybe we need to just simplify it and drop some of the steps down, maybe push out 12 at a time or something along those lines there, just to make it a bit easier for an organisation to engage with.
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful point. And yeah, I'd love to see more corporations and businesses kind of bringing that on board and bringing a lot of the ideas that we've just discussed today. I think that could be really positive for everyone. Has anyone got any more questions, or are we close to wrapping up, or any of the speakers want to come back on anything that's just been said? And thank you all so much, by the way. A brilliant, such a nice conversation in the chat, and so many lovely contributions and questions. So thank you.
Francesca had an interesting question.
Francesca.
Hello, hi everyone. Thank you for such a interesting discussion today, Amy, Grace, Lola, and Balaka, who I think have left now. But I'd be interested to hear anyone's kind of views of on this in the room. And I have a bit of a personal anecdote which I think frames the question. So I recently spent some time in the Philippines, my mother's home, and this time really got me thinking about kind of the economics of Filipino society and families a bit more deeply, in opposition to the West, where I've grown up. And the Philippines is a very kind of collectivist communal society. For example, generations of families often live in one place and have strong financial obligations to each other. And so in that way, kind of the needs of the community and the extended family unit are prioritized over the individual, which I think reflects a much more community-orientated society. There's actually 7 words in the Filipino language which mean community, which I thought was really interesting. And I think individuals, and particularly elders, are much less susceptible to loneliness and isolation. And I think this can be kind of applied across lots of different countries in Southeast Asia. But having said this, and I think this is simplifying it a lot, But it could be said that this collectivist mindset, alongside other factors such as government corruption and the impacts of colonialism, is a contributing factor to the slow economic development of the Philippines. So I guess my question is that in the West, where our financial obligations are typically limited to the nuclear family or even to the individual, and we have a much more individualistic society, which Grace was talking about, I'd be interested maybe about how we could learn from more collectivist societies, and how we can reconcile some of those ideas while still maintaining a healthy economy and workforce.
Yeah, and we've run out of speakers, but I think if we just put on a spotlight, I'm sure we've got some amazing people in the room that all could have been speakers. So maybe we can open that up. Does anybody have any thoughts to jump in with? Kirsty.
Hello.
Hi.
I would love to comment on this, because for me, I think it's sort of a little bit of what Grace was saying, is that from what you've just shared, Francesca, I think it's a different way of being, is how I would phrase it. It's like a completely different energy or space to speak from and come from. It's a totally different way of seeing the world. And I think that's why, like, things like the 32 steps are really, really good. And there's a shift that needs to happen where people currently feel tired, like they're exhausted. They already feel like they're doing enough. And I think that's where we want to start looking at being, and who are we being? And so there's another level of the conversation that's at, like, it's a conversation that we don't really talk about, which is, who am I being right now? Where am I coming from? I've become conditioned from my own past, and that is affecting the lenses through which I see the world. We don't talk about that. That's how humans experience reality, right? So it's a whole level of conversation that gets ignored and bypassed. We just think this is how the world is. We're not going, wait, we've created a collective reality that's actually just an illusion based on our stories of our past. And each country does that on a collective level as well, right? So individuals are doing that, and then countries, like collections of individuals, do the same thing, where we have stories about our past that have formed who we're being now as a collective society. And you can see it in the UK and in the West, where, as Grace was saying, there's like an underlying kind of social stuff and psychological stuff that is built to the way that the world functions right now makes perfect sense based on where we've come from. So how do we get the change in our beingness, not just what we're doing, but who are we actually being? Where are we coming from? Where are we speaking from? Where do we see the world from? How are we actually, it's a relational thing for me. And I think that's where there's an addition to, like, telling people or asking them or inviting them maybe to do different things, is also the invitation to be different, which from a very quick look at the 32 steps, is like the first few are looking at that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a heavier thing on that.
I love all of that, Kirsty. You said it so well and so beautifully. I think my answer would be that actually, when circumstances enable it, like the switch from consumers back to citizens, would happen. And, you know, all of those other shifts could happen quite naturally, because we evolved in communities. Like, we've spent most of our history as a species living in communities. So it is, in all of these mystical ways, it's in the way that our brains have developed, and how, like, we have developed all of these different cultures. So I think it's it's to do with the environment, and hopefully, actually, if that environment slightly shifted, it then wouldn't be that difficult to embody that different way of being that you're talking about there.
Can I add just a tiny bit? It's a tiny bit. I agree 100%, because I think what's happened is that the capitalist, like, society that we've ended up with has put most people in survival mode, and in survival mode, you can only run on autopilot, not conscious choice. And that's why I think when you get to, like, I'm currently in Spain, and it's like a totally different way of living. Like, I was talking to my partner this morning, they don't open the supermarkets like 24 hours. And I was like, I've got to wait till 9 o'clock to go to the supermarket on a Monday. But it's just a small thing to go, yeah, that's really interesting to me, actually, because why would you need a supermarket to be open all hours of the day? It's just small things like that, but you're like, because we've got this kind of Western thing of like all the time, you need to be able to buy everything all the time. And you're just in like, survival mode. And I think as we start to shift that, you'll find we're returning to the previous way of being, which is a lot more collectivist in nature. So I'm going to shut up now.
No, so good.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Kirsty. I think you touched on a really important point, and I think actually a really nice one to end on, which is like the importance of like reimagining and realizing that we have the power to do that. And I think that also comes back with Francesca's example and Grace's point that we created this society, this system that we're talking about, and these labour markets that have not come out of nowhere. And I think when we think about countries that organise in a different way and have different ways of being, we can really see the power that for change and for reimagining. So no, thank you so much. That's
and I think connecting is how you reimagine as well, right? As soon as we speak to one another and feel more connected and relaxed, we can. Wally, do you have a parting word of wisdom?
I do. I could finally come in somewhere because it has been a fantastic event. Thank you so much, Natasha and the team. For example, I run with the team. I'm part of Celebrate Life programs, workshops in a part of a Brixton area where I live. And the workshops are about learning about yourself, connecting with yourself. And the people come in, and it's nearly everybody from the Black community in this part of Brixton. And so they are a community. But actually, who comes in are individuals who are struggling with themselves. And that's the area I'm trying to address and work with, is getting that self become a community within itself, and then having that light switched on, or whatever way you want to put it, embracing others, because people are consumed at the moment with their worries, and they're separated, and that's another form of loneliness in a way too. And so you want to bring people together, but you want to bring people together so that they are feeling healed and well and growing and thriving in themselves, and then they're fit for bringing these other things to happen. So I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, thank you so much. Here. And Kirsty's just said that this event was heart-opening, and I love that. And yeah, I think we do find that when we talk about togetherness, it is a great kind of starting off point for talking about all of these other things, because we that's what we're doing in lots of different contexts, talking about the role of togetherness in solving problems. So yes, good. Well, so lovely to see you all, and huge round of applause and thank you to Abigail Harrington.
Thank you, everyone. It's been wonderful, and thank you, Natasha, as well for bringing me on board and sharing the 32 steps with me. So thank you all. It's been really great and wonderful points.